There comes a point when an internal document ceases to be a technical contribution and takes on the weight of an ideological act. This is what is happening with the text on the liturgy presented by Cardinal Roche to the consistory, a document that provoked a very harsh reaction from Bishop Athanasius Schneider. His words do not come from marginal environments, but from an interview given on January 20th to journalist Diane Montagna in a public and verifiable context. According to Schneider, the problem isn't a divergence in liturgical sensibilities, but rather an approach flawed from the outset. Roche's document, he argues, doesn't arise from an impartial assessment of the history of the Roman Rite, but from a position already established: opposition to the traditional Mass. This isn't an implicit accusation. Schneider uses explicit terms and speaks of manipulation, rigidity, and methodological dishonesty. The key issue is method. Schneider argues that the text uses history as a rhetorical tool, not as a criterion of truth. Sources are selected, quotations are isolated, and conclusions are anticipated. It seems driven by an agenda aimed at denigrating this liturgical form and ultimately eliminating it from ecclesial life, he states, without softening his judgment. It's a weighty statement because it doesn't challenge a detail, but the overall intention of the document. When Roche claims that the liturgy would always be the object of continuous reform, Schneider responds by introducing a distinction that overturns the entire system: organic development versus engineered reform. The first is the way the Church has preserved the Roman Rite for centuries. The second is what happens when the liturgy is treated as a project to be remade, not as a living reality to be transmitted. According to Schneider, the Roman Rite remained essentially stable from the 11th century until the mid-20th century. Changes, yes, but never a reconstruction. This balance, he argues, is broken by the Missal of 1970, which represents not continuity, but a fracture, not evolution, but a structural discontinuity. The criticism becomes even more trenchant when it shifts from the historical to the theological level. Schneider argues that the post-conciliar liturgical reform changed the very orientation of worship from theocentric to anthropocentric. It's not a question of taste or celebratory style, but of spiritual logic. Quoting Bonifatius Luyx, he speaks openly of the bulldozer of anthropocentric horizontalism, an image that describes a process of leveling, not enrichment. This is where the Second Vatican Council comes into play. Schneider insists on an often overlooked point. The Council describes the liturgy as a participation in the heavenly liturgy, as a sacred and contemplative reality, not as a primarily assembly space. Roche's document, according to him, not only betrays previous tradition, but also contradicts the conciliar theology of the liturgy itself. One of the most controversial passages concerns the use of Pius V's Quo Primum. Roche uses it as an argument in favor of liturgical uniformity. Schneider counters that this is a selective reading. Pius V, he recalls, did not abolish the ancient rites, but protected them. The Roman Church has always known unity without standardization. Confusing the two, he states, means distorting history. In one particularly harsh passage, Schneider declares, Cardinal Roche makes selective reference to Quo Primum, distorting its meaning and using the document to support an anti-traditional interpretation. Here, the criticism is no longer merely academic, it's moral. Manipulation is openly discussed. Even more explosive is the question of the relationship between Vatican II and the Novus Ordo, Schneider rejects the automatic identification of the Council with the Reformed Missal. He recalls that Sacrosanctum Concilium called for prudent reforms without disruptions, and that the Missal of 1970 goes far beyond these indications. It is not, in his opinion, the Mass of the Council. Indeed, Schneider claims that the true conciliar implementation was the Missal of 1965, a rarely mentioned but documented fact. That Missal introduced measured changes without demolishing the traditional structure of the rite. The radical reform came later, and not at the explicit request of the Council Fathers. In support of this thesis, Schneider recalls a historical fact that Roche's document ignores. In 1967, the Synod of Bishops rejected the prototype of the new rite. Not a marginal commission, but an assembly composed largely of the Council Fathers themselves. Despite this refusal, the reform was nevertheless promulgated. This seriously calls into question the idea of an ecclesial consensus. When Roche argues that liturgical pluralism threatens unity, Schneider responds by reversing the argument. The Church, he states, has existed for centuries with a plurality of rites. The fractures arose not from diversity, but from forced imposition. To say that pluralism freezes division is manipulative and dishonest, he states. Another point demolished is the idea that the traditional Mass has only been tolerated by recent popes. Schneider recalls that John Paul II spoke publicly of it, and that Benedict XVI, with Summorum Pontificum, recognized its legal rights, not temporary concessions but full legitimacy. The speech concludes with a broader complaint. Schneider speaks of a crisis of liturgical competence within the hierarchy, which allows ideological documents to circulate without any real critical discussion. But above all, it speaks of justice. Restrictions against faithful attached to tradition are called discriminatory, capable of creating inferior Catholics in direct contradiction to the official language of inclusion. Finally, the appeal to Leo XIV. Schneider calls for an act of courage to re-establish equal dignity and rights for both forms of the Roman Rite, not as a political compromise, but as a choice for ecclesial peace. The conclusion is clear and unequivocal. Tradition does not survive thanks to documents, but it cannot be erased from documents either. And precisely for this reason, according to Schneider, any attempt to suppress it is doomed to failure. If you appreciate this outreach service and think it's valuable, you can support us by leaving a super thank you. We're independent, and this work requires time, research, and dedication. Your support helps us continue. What do you think? If you liked the video, comment, Amen. God bless you.